Alina Marquez felt her hand tighten around the glass of wine the moment the man across the table said her new name for the first time. "Grace," he said, testing the sound of it like he was trying on a coat. "That is who you really are. Alina is just what your parents happen to call you." The wedding hall was full of laughter and clinking cutlery, but for Alina, everything narrowed to that one sentence. She laughed too, because that seemed like the right thing to do, but somewhere beneath the laugh, a small alarm rang and then went quiet again, the way alarms do when we decide not to listen to them. His name was Julian Reyes. He had walked into her life 2 hours earlier, introduced by a mutual friend at the reception of a wedding neither of them had expected to enjoy. He was tall, sure of himself, and spoke with the kind of confidence that made people lean in rather than look away. Alina taught piano to children in a small studio near her apartment, and she had come to the wedding alone, planning to leave early. Instead, she stayed until the lights dimmed and the band played its last song, sitting beside a man who had already decided, in his own mind, who she was going to become. "Grace," he said again later that night, walking her to her car, "it suits you. There is something calm about you, something steady. Alina sounds like a name for someone still figuring things out. Grace sounds like someone who already knows." She should have asked him what he meant by that. She should have told him that Alina was the name her grandmother gave her, the name stitched into every memory she had of her childhood kitchen, her father's laugh, her mother's hands teaching her to fold dough. Instead, she smiled and said nothing, because the compliment felt good, and because Julian had a way of saying things that made you feel like you were being seen for the first time in your life. That was how it began. Not with a shout, not with a warning, but with a name offered like a gift. 3 weeks later, Julian called her every evening at exactly 7 o'clock. He remembered small details about her life that she had only mentioned once, in passing. He noticed when she was tired before she noticed it herself. He brought her tea when she had a cold, and sat with her for hours while she graded her students' practice sheets, asking questions about music theory as if he genuinely wanted to understand the world she lived in. Alina's best friend, Priya, met him for the first time at a small coffee shop near the studio. Afterward, walking home, Priya said, "He's intense, isn't he?" "He's attentive," Alina said, correcting her gently. "Sure," Priya said, but there was something careful in her voice, something that Alina chose not to examine too closely. By the second month, Julian had stopped using her name at all. He called her Grace in front of his friends, in front of waiters, in front of the barista who made her coffee every morning. At first, Alina corrected him quietly, saying, "It's Alina, actually," with an embarrassed little laugh. But Julian would simply smile and say, "I know your name. I'm choosing to see you differently. Isn't that a good thing?" She wanted to believe it was a good thing. She wanted to believe that being renamed by someone who loved her was a form of being cherished, not a form of being erased. There is a particular kind of confusion that comes from being told, again and again, that something uncomfortable is actually a compliment. It works slowly, like water finding its way into a crack in stone. You do not notice the crack widening until the stone splits. One Sunday afternoon, Julian took her to meet his mother. His mother was a soft-spoken woman named Carmen, who hugged Alina warmly and said, "Julian has told me so much about you, Alina." Julian, standing just behind his mother, corrected her immediately. "Mom, she goes by Grace now." Carmen blinked, confused, then smiled politely and adjusted. "Of course, Grace, what a lovely name." Alina stood there, holding a plate of food she had not asked for, watching a woman she had just met accept a name that was not hers, simply because her son had said so. Something in Alina's chest tightened, but she said nothing. She told herself it was not worth the argument. She told herself that names did not matter as much as the love behind them. That night, lying awake in her apartment, Alina tried to remember the last time she had corrected Julian and had it stick. She could not think of one single time. The following week, Julian asked her to move in with him. He framed it beautifully, the way he framed everything, with words that made resistance feel small and ungrateful. "I want to build a life with you," he said, kneeling beside her on the couch, holding both her hands in his. "I want to wake up every morning next to Grace. Not because Alina isn't wonderful, but because Grace is who you become when you're with me. Don't you feel that too?" Alina looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her studio, her students, her mother's voice calling her name across the kitchen when she was a child. She thought about the little alarm that had gone off the night they met, the one she had silenced without meaning to. "I feel something," she said quietly. It was true, though she could not yet say what that something was. She moved in with him 2 weeks later. The apartment Julian chose for them was beautiful, filled with light and modern furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine. He had decorated one corner of the living room specifically with things he said Grace would love: soft cushions, a reading lamp, a small bookshelf filled with novels Alina had never mentioned wanting to read. It should have felt like a thoughtful gesture. Instead, standing in that corner for the first time, Alina felt like a guest in a room built for someone else, someone she was expected to grow into. Her piano, the one piece of furniture that was entirely hers, sat in the far corner of the apartment, slightly turned toward the wall, as if it too had been asked to make room. Weeks passed in a blur of dinners, gatherings, and quiet evenings that Julian filled with conversation while Alina listened. She noticed, slowly, that she had stopped finishing her own sentences. She would start to say what she thought about a film, or a decision, or a plan for the weekend, and Julian would gently take the thought from her hands and finish it in his own words, usually landing somewhere close to what she meant, but never quite exact. And each time, Alina would nod, because correcting him felt like more effort than it was worth, and because he always sounded so certain that he was right. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Julian looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something steadier and more serious than his usual charm. He reached for her hand across the table. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to really think about it before you answer." Alina felt her heartbeat quicken. "Okay." "I want you to stop correcting people when they call you Grace," he said. "I want it to be your name now, not just with me, with everyone, your family, your friends, your students. I want Grace to be who you are fully, not just a nickname you wear when it's convenient." The room felt very quiet. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. "That's my whole name you're asking me to give up," Alina said slowly. "I'm not asking you to give up anything," Julian said, his voice gentle, patient, the voice of a man who believed completely in his own reasoning. "I'm asking you to become who I already see. Alina was who you were before. Grace is who you are with me. Can't a person grow into a new name the way they grow into a new life?" Alina wanted to argue. She could feel the shape of the argument forming in her mind, the words gathering like a held breath. But when she opened her mouth, what came out instead was much smaller than what she felt. "Okay," she said, "I'll try." Julian smiled, satisfied, and pulled her into a hug that felt, for a moment, like relief. But later that night, lying beside him in the dark, Alina stared at the ceiling and thought about her grandmother's voice, saying her name across a warm kitchen decades ago, and wondered when, exactly, she had agreed to let that voice fade. She did not know it yet, but that quiet, half-spoken "okay" was the first thread pulled from a much larger unraveling, one that would take an entire year to complete. The first time Alina introduced herself as Grace to a stranger, her voice cracked slightly on the word, as if her own mouth did not fully trust what it was saying. It was at a work dinner for Julian's company, a long table filled with people in sharp suits and polished shoes, laughter rising and falling around glasses of wine. A colleague of Julian's, a woman named Charlotte, turned to Alina and asked her name. "Grace," Alina said, and the word felt strange, borrowed, like clothing that did not quite fit. "Grace, lovely to meet you," Charlotte said warmly, And just like that, another person in the world knew her only by a name that was not hers. Julian, sitting beside her, placed his hand over hers on the table, a small gesture of approval. Alina told herself the warmth she felt from that gesture was worth the strange hollow feeling underneath it. She was becoming skilled at this particular trade, exchanging small pieces of herself for small moments of his approval, and not yet noticing how much had already been spent. Over the following weeks, the changes came quietly, almost too small to notice individually, the way a room grows dark not all at once but shadow by shadow. Julian began choosing what she wore to important events, always with kind words wrapped around the request. "You'd look beautiful in the blue dress tonight, Grace, not the green one. Green isn't really you." Alina wore the blue dress. Julian began deciding which of her friends she saw and how often. "Priya seems like she brings a lot of tension into your life. Have you noticed how tired you look after seeing her?" Alina began seeing Priya less. She told herself these were small compromises, the ordinary give and take of a serious relationship. Everyone made adjustments for the person they loved. She reminded herself of this every time a decision that once would have been entirely her own passed, instead, through Julian's approval first. At the piano studio, her students noticed a change in her too, though none of them could name it. Alina had always been warm and quick to laugh during lessons, correcting a child's finger position with a gentle joke, praising even the smallest improvement with real enthusiasm. Slowly, without meaning to, she grew quieter. She still taught well, still corrected mistakes with patience, but the laughter came less often, and some of her students, young as they were, began to ask if she was feeling okay. "I'm fine," she told a 10-year-old named Oliver one afternoon, after he asked why she seemed sad during his lesson. "Just tired." She was not sure that was true, but it was easier to say than the truth, which she herself did not fully understand yet. One evening, Priya invited Alina to dinner, insisting they had not spent real time together in months. Alina hesitated before agreeing, feeling a strange guilt at the idea of an evening that did not include Julian, as if she needed permission for something so simple. She did not ask him. She told herself that was a small victory. At the restaurant, Priya studied her closely across the table, the way old friends do when they sense something has shifted but cannot yet say what. "You seem different," Priya said finally, after their food arrived and the small talk had run its course. "Different how?" "Quieter. You used to talk over me all the time, remember? You'd get excited about something and just start talking before I even finished my sentence. You haven't done that in months." Alina laughed, though it did not feel like a real laugh. "Maybe I'm just growing up, getting more thoughtful." "Maybe," Priya said, though her tone suggested she did not believe it. She reached across the table and took Alina's hand. "Can I ask you something, and you actually answer honestly?" Alina nodded, though something in her chest tightened in warning. "When did you stop disagreeing with Julian? About anything?" The question landed harder than Alina expected. She opened her mouth to answer, to list all the small disagreements she had surely had with him over the past months, proof that she was still herself inside this relationship. But as she searched her memory, she found nothing. Not one argument. Not one moment where she had held her ground against something he wanted. She had agreed to the dress, the dinners, the friends she saw less of, the name. She had agreed to all of it, every time, with a smile that had started to feel less like happiness and more like practice. "I don't know," Alina said quietly, and for the first time in a long while, her voice sounded like her own again, small and uncertain but real. Priya squeezed her hand. "I'm not trying to tell you what to do, I just want you to notice. That's all, just notice." That night, Alina walked home slowly, taking the longer route through the park instead of the direct path, needing the extra minutes to think. The evening air was cool, and she found a bench near a small fountain and sat down, watching the water catch the last of the streetlight. She thought about the version of herself that existed before Julian, the woman who had once told a difficult parent at the studio, firmly and without apology, that she would not lower her fees for a lesson that required more preparation, not less. The woman who had traveled alone to a music competition 3 states away because no one else believed she would place, and had come back with a trophy and a story she told at every dinner party for a year afterward. That woman had been loud sometimes, stubborn often, and entirely her own. Where had she gone? Alina did not have an answer that night, and she walked the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that asks more questions than it answers. When she arrived, Julian was waiting up for her, visibly relieved when she walked through the door. "You were gone a long time," he said, not quite a question, not quite an accusation, but something in between. "Priya and I talked a lot," Alina said. "About what?" Alina hesitated. "Just things, life." Julian studied her for a moment, the way he sometimes did when he sensed there was more beneath the surface of what she was saying. Then he softened, pulling her into a hug. "I missed you," he said. "The apartment feels strange when Grace isn't in it." Alina stood in his arms, staring over his shoulder at the piano in the corner, still turned slightly toward the wall. She did not correct him. She did not say her name. She simply let the hug end on its own, and later that night, once Julian had fallen asleep, she got up quietly, sat down at the piano, and played very softly for almost an hour, letting her fingers say things her voice had stopped saying out loud. The months that followed brought smaller versions of that same pattern, over and over, a quiet erosion that Alina both noticed and did not fully let herself see. Julian began speaking for her more often in group settings, answering questions that were directed at her before she had a chance to open her mouth. "Grace loves Italian food," he would say when someone asked where she wanted to eat, even though Alina had never expressed a strong preference either way. "Grace doesn't really enjoy parties that go too late," he would explain to hosts, even on nights when Alina might have wanted to stay. Each time, Alina told herself it did not matter. Each time, a small piece of the space she used to take up in the world grew a little smaller. Her mother called one afternoon, her voice warm and familiar over the phone. "Alina, sweetheart, I haven't heard from you in weeks. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Mom," Alina said, and for the length of that phone call, hearing her real name spoken so easily and so naturally, something in her chest loosened, like a held breath finally released. She talked for almost an hour, longer than she had talked freely with anyone in months, laughing at her mother's stories about the neighbors, sharing small details about her students, sounding, for those 60 minutes, entirely like herself again. When Julian came home and asked who she had been talking to, Alina told him, still smiling from the conversation. "That's nice," Julian said, though something in his expression had shifted, a tightness around his eyes that Alina had learned without realizing it to read carefully. "Did she call you Alina the whole time?" "She's my mother," Alina said. "Of course she did." Julian nodded slowly, saying nothing more about it that evening. But over dinner, Alina caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something between concern and calculation, as though he were recalculating a plan that had briefly slipped out of his control. She did not know it then, but that phone call and the hour of laughter it had given her would become the reason for what happened next, at a dinner party 3 weeks later, the night everything finally cracked open in front of witnesses who had no idea what they were watching. The dinner party was Julian's idea, though he framed it as a gift to Alina, a chance to bring her family and his family together at last, under one roof, over one long table. He spent an entire Saturday arranging flowers and choosing wine, and when Alina offered to help with the seating chart, he waved her off gently. "Let me handle it," he said. "I want everything to be perfect for you." Alina's mother, Margaret, arrived first, carrying a dish of the rice pudding she had made every year since Alina was a child, wrapped carefully in a towel to keep it warm. She hugged Alina tightly at the door, holding her a moment longer than usual. "You look thin," Margaret said quietly, studying her daughter's face. "Are you eating enough?" "I'm fine, Mom," Elena said, the same phrase she had been repeating for months now, worn smooth from overuse. The evening began well enough. Julian's parents arrived shortly after, followed by his sister, a sharp and funny woman named Isabel, and two of Julian's closest friends from work, a couple named Daniel and Rosa. The table filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses, candles casting a warm light over plates of roasted vegetables and fresh bread. For a while, Elena allowed herself to relax, caught up in the easy rhythm of a good meal shared among people who, on the surface, all seemed to genuinely like one another. It was Margaret who broke the rhythm without meaning to, simply by being herself. Partway through the main course, she turned to Elena and asked, in the casual tone of a mother checking in on her child, "Elena, did you finish that piece you were working on? The one for the recital next spring?" The table did not go silent immediately. For a moment, conversation continued around them, unaware that anything significant had happened. But Elena felt Julian's hand still on the table beside his glass, and when she glanced at him, his jaw had tightened in a way she recognized instantly, though she had never seen it directed so openly in front of so many people before. "She goes by Grace now," Julian said, his voice pitched just loud enough to cut through the surrounding chatter, sharp in a way his voice rarely was in public. "I've mentioned that before, Margaret." The table went quiet. Margaret blinked, her fork paused halfway to her mouth, confusion crossing her face before it hardened into something else, something closer to disbelief. "I'm sorry," she said. "Her name is Elena. I gave her that name myself in the hospital 29 years ago. I think I'm allowed to use it." "It's not about being allowed," Julian said, his tone smoothing back into its usual calm, though the smoothness felt, to Elena, more unsettling than the sharpness had. "It's about respecting the person she's chosen to become. She prefers Grace now. Isn't that right, Grace?" Every face at the table turned toward Elena. Isabel's eyebrows had risen slightly. Daniel and Rosa exchanged a quick, uncertain glance. Julian's mother, Carmen, looked down at her plate, uncomfortable, while Julian's father simply watched, waiting to see how his son's story would end. Elena felt the weight of every gaze at once, pressing down on her chest until it became difficult to draw a full breath. She opened her mouth, fully intending to say something, anything, to smooth over the moment the way she had smoothed over hundreds of smaller moments before this one. But nothing came. Not agreement, not correction, not a single word. She simply sat there, her fork resting against the edge of her plate, and said nothing at all. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of statement. Margaret set down her fork carefully, the small clink of metal against porcelain unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Elena," she said, deliberately, watching her daughter's face rather than Julian's. "Is that true? Do you prefer Grace now?" Elena looked at her mother, and for one long moment, something in her wanted desperately to answer honestly, to say the word no out loud in a room full of witnesses, to reclaim, in that single syllable, everything that had been quietly taken from her over the past year. But the word would not come. Her throat had closed around it, tight and unwilling, and instead of speaking, she simply looked down at her plate, her cheeks burning, and shook her head slightly, not in denial of the name, but in something closer to surrender. "She's tired," Julian said smoothly, filling the silence before it could stretch any further. "It's been a long week. Let's not make this a bigger thing than it is." Isabel, Julian's sister, cleared her throat and made a small joke about the wine, an obvious attempt to steer the table back towards safer waters. Conversation slowly resumed around them, quieter now, more careful, the easy rhythm of earlier in the evening replaced with a kind of forced normalcy that everyone at the table could feel but no one wanted to name. Elena did not speak again for the rest of the dinner. She answered direct questions with the smallest possible words, a nod here, a quiet yes there, but she offered nothing beyond what was strictly required. She watched the conversation move around her like water around a stone, aware of every word spoken but unable or unwilling to add her own voice to any of it. Margaret watched her daughter carefully throughout the rest of the meal, her expression shifting from confusion to something quieter and more worried, though she said nothing further about the name. When the evening finally ended and the last guests had gathered their coats, Margaret hugged Alina tightly at the door, holding her by the shoulders afterward and looking directly into her eyes. "Call me," Margaret said quietly just for her daughter to hear. "Whenever you're ready, I'll be there." Alina nodded, unable to speak even then, and watched her mother walk down the hallway toward the elevator, glancing back once before the doors closed. The drive home from dropping off the last of Julian's family was quiet in a way that felt entirely different from Alina's usual silence. This was not the comfortable quiet of two people who did not need words to feel close. This was something heavier, something that filled the car like smoke, thick enough that Alina found herself watching the streetlights pass outside the window rather than looking anywhere near Julian. "I'm sorry if that felt harsh back there," Julian said finally, breaking the silence somewhere near the halfway point of the drive. "I didn't mean to embarrass your mother. I just wanted to be consistent. It confuses people when the name changes depending on who's in the room." Alina said nothing. "Grace," Julian said, glancing over at her, "did you hear me?" Still, Alina said nothing. It was not defiance, not exactly, not yet. It was something closer to an inability, a strange and total lock that had settled over her voice the moment her mother had asked that simple question at the dinner table. She searched inside herself for words and found only a vast, echoing quiet, as though something essential had gone still. Julian reached over and took her hand, his voice softening. "Talk to me. What are you thinking?" Alina opened her mouth. She wanted desperately to say something, anything, to explain the strange storm moving through her. But the silence held firm, unmovable, and after a moment she simply shook her head and turned back toward the window, watching her own reflection ghost across the glass, transparent and strange, layered over the passing streetlights like a woman caught between two versions of herself. They arrived home without another word passing between them. Julian tried twice more to start a conversation, first apologizing again, more elaborately this time, and then growing slightly frustrated when his apology was met only with silence. "You're really not going to talk to me?" he asked, standing in the doorway of their bedroom, his voice edged with something that might have been hurt, or might have been the early warning signs of anger. "This is a little dramatic, don't you think? I said I was sorry." Alina sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, looking at a point somewhere on the carpet rather than at him. She wanted to tell him that this was not about the apology. She wanted to tell him that something inside her had gone quiet in a way she did not fully understand, that the silence was not a punishment aimed at him, but a kind of protection she had built for herself without meaning to, brick by brick, over the course of an entire year. She wanted to say all of this and more, but none of it came, and eventually Julian sighed, shook his head, and left the room, muttering something about giving her space. Alina sat alone in the quiet apartment for a long time after he left, listening to the muffled sound of the television turning on in the living room, the low hum of some late-night program filling the space where conversation should have been. She thought about her mother's face at the dinner table, the careful way she had asked her question, the hurt she had tried to hide when Alina failed to answer honestly. She thought about the year that had led to this moment. Every small compromise stacked one on top of another, until they had built a wall she no longer knew how to climb over. Later that night, once the apartment had gone fully dark and Julian's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, Alina rose quietly and walked to the piano in the corner of the living room. She did not turn on the lights. She sat down on the familiar bench, resting her fingers lightly on the keys without pressing down, feeling the cool, smooth surface beneath her fingertips. For a long moment, she simply sat there in the dark, breathing. Then very softly, so as not to wake him, she began to play. Not a song she knew, not something borrowed from a lesson book or a recital program, but something new, something forming itself beneath her fingers as she went, uncertain and searching at first, then slowly gathering shape and direction. The melody was quiet and unresolved, circling back on itself again and again, as though searching for a note it could not yet find. She played for almost 2 hours that night, long after her fingers grew tired, stopping only when the first pale light of morning began to soften the edges of the windows. When she finally rose from the bench, something inside her had shifted, though she could not yet name what it was. She knew only that the silence she had carried through the dinner party, through the car ride home, through Julian's questions and apologies, had not been an ending. It had been a beginning, one she would not fully understand for many months to come, a silence that would stretch on, deliberate and unbroken, for an entire year, while Alina quietly, carefully, began the long work of finding her way back to herself. The weeks after the dinner party settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that Julian mistook almost immediately for peace. Alina spoke less at home, offered fewer opinions about dinner plans or weekend outings, and agreed to nearly everything he suggested with a calm, quiet nod. To Julian, this looked like contentment finally taking root, the natural result, he believed, of Alina settling into the life and the name he had shaped for her. He told his sister as much over the phone one evening, not realizing Alina could hear him from the next room. "She's finally comfortable," Julian said, his voice warm with satisfaction. "I think she just needed time to grow into things." What Julian did not understand, because he had never truly asked, was that Alina's quiet was not comfort. It was construction. Somewhere behind her calm expression, behind the small nods and the softly spoken agreements, Alina had begun building something entirely her own, brick by careful brick, in a part of herself Julian had never learned to reach. It started small. A few days after the dinner party, Alina opened a bank account in her own name, one Julian did not know existed, and began setting aside a small portion of what she earned from her piano lessons each week. It was not a large amount, not enough to change anything overnight, but the act itself mattered more than the number. Each deposit felt like a quiet, private rebellion, a small declaration that some part of her life still belonged entirely to her. She also began waking early, before Julian rose for work, using the quiet hour before sunrise to write in a notebook she kept hidden at the bottom of her bag at the studio. She wrote about her students, about small victories in their lessons, about pieces of music that had caught her attention on the radio. She wrote, too, about smaller things, memories from childhood, fragments of songs half remembered, thoughts she had once spoken aloud without hesitation and now kept carefully to herself. The notebook became a place where her voice, silenced everywhere else, could still exist freely, unedited and unwatched. Her piano playing changed as well, deepening into something more serious than it had been in years. Each night, once Julian had fallen asleep, Alina would sit at the piano in the dark and work on the piece that had first emerged from her fingers the night of the dinner party. It grew slowly, month by month, gathering new sections, new turns, new resolutions that had not existed in its earliest form. She did not tell Julian about it. She did not play it during the day when he might hear. It remained entirely hidden, a private world built note by note in the safety of darkness. One afternoon in early spring, nearly 4 months after the dinner party, Alina ran into Priya outside a small grocery store near the studio. Priya's face lit up with surprise and relief at the sight of her. "I've been calling," Priya said, hugging her tightly. "You haven't answered in weeks." "I know," Alina said. "I'm sorry." "Do you have time for coffee, right now?" Alina hesitated, an old habit rising instinctively, the familiar pull toward checking whether this plan fit within the shape of a day Julian had not approved. But then, quietly, she pushed the hesitation aside. "Yes," she said, "I have time." They sat together at a small table outside the coffee shop, sunlight warm on their shoulders, and for the first time in many months, Alina found herself talking freely, without carefully measuring each word before she spoke it. She told Priya about the notebook, about the bank account, about the piece of music growing slowly beneath her hands each night. She did not tell her everything, not yet, but she told her enough that Priya's eyes filled with a mixture of relief and quiet anger by the time she finished. "You know, none of this sounds like someone who's happy," Priya said gently. "I know," Elena said. "I'm not ready to talk about the rest of it yet, but I wanted you to know I haven't disappeared, not completely." Priya squeezed her hand across the table. "Whenever you're ready, I'm here. And Elena," she added, deliberately using the name, "you don't owe anyone an explanation for taking your time." Elena nodded, grateful for a name spoken without correction, without a second name laid over it like a shadow. Over the following months, small moments like this one accumulated, each one a quiet thread in the larger fabric Elena was weaving without Julian's knowledge. She began meeting Priya for coffee every other week, always careful about the timing, always vague with Julian about where the hours had gone. She reconnected, cautiously, with a former classmate from music school named Nathan, who ran a small community recital series in a converted theater across town. When Nathan mentioned, almost casually, that the recital was open to any performer with an original piece ready to share, something in Elena's chest tightened with a feeling she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. She did not tell him yes immediately. She did not, in fact, tell anyone yes for several more months, turning the idea over carefully in her mind the way she once might have turned over a difficult phrase of music, testing it from every angle before deciding whether it could hold weight. At home, Julian remained largely unaware of the world quietly forming beneath the surface of his household. He noticed Elena seemed calmer, more settled, and took this as confirmation that his instincts about her had been right all along. He continued introducing her as Grace at every gathering, continued making small decisions on her behalf, continued believing, with complete sincerity, that he understood the woman sitting across the dinner table from him each night. There were moments, though, when something flickered beneath his confidence, brief cracks in the smooth surface of his certainty. One evening he found the notebook, left carelessly on the kitchen counter after Elena had rushed out for a lesson. He did not read it fully, respecting in some small way the privacy of the pages, but he noticed the handwriting filled every line, dense and urgent, clearly the product of many mornings of writing rather than one single sitting. "What's this?" he asked when she returned home that evening, holding up the notebook. "Just thoughts," Elena said, taking it gently from his hands. "Nothing important." "You've never mentioned keeping a journal before." "I started a few months ago," Elena said, meeting his eyes steadily, something new and unfamiliar in the quality of her gaze, something Julian could not quite name but felt faintly as a kind of distance opening between them. "Can I read it sometime?" "Maybe someday," Elena said, and something in her tone closed the conversation as firmly as a door. Julian let the matter drop, though the small unease it planted did not fully disappear. He began, without fully admitting it to himself, watching Elena more closely in the weeks that followed, noticing the hours she spent at the studio growing slightly longer, noticing the faint, unfamiliar confidence that had crept into the way she carried herself, small but unmistakable, like a plant finally reaching sunlight after months in shadow. 10 months into what Elena had begun privately calling, in the pages of her notebook, her silent year, Nathan called again about the recital, this time with a firm date and a request for her final decision. Elena sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment after the call ended, staring at the piece of paper where she had written the date, a Saturday evening in early summer, exactly 1 year. She realized with a small shock, from the night of the dinner party. She thought about her mother's face across that table, the careful, hurt confusion in her eyes when Elena had failed to answer her simple question. She thought about the silence that had followed, the silence she had carried through the car ride home, through Julian's apologies, through months of small, careful rebuilding in notebooks and bank statements and late-night piano sessions conducted entirely in the dark. She thought, too, about the piece of music that had grown, note by note, beneath her hands over the course of that same year, now nearly finished, waiting only for a room full of people and a moment of courage to be heard. Alina picked up her pen and wrote Nathan's name and the date at the top of a fresh page in her notebook, followed by a single line beneath it. 1 year, time to finish what started that night. She closed the notebook, tucked it carefully into her bag, and for the first time since the dinner party, allowed herself to imagine, clearly and without hesitation, the sound of her own name spoken aloud in a room full of strangers, chosen freely by her own voice, and no one else's. The final 2 months of the silent year passed both slowly and quickly, the way important stretches of time often do, each day carrying the ordinary weight of routine while beneath the surface, something larger gathered itself steadily toward its release. Alina continued teaching, continued her early morning writing, continued practicing her piece late into the night, refining its final movement until it felt, finally, complete. Julian, sensing something shifting but unable to name it, grew slightly more attentive in those final weeks, bringing home small gifts, suggesting quiet evenings together, behaving in small ways like a man trying to hold onto something he could feel slipping quietly through his fingers. Alina accepted his gestures with polite warmth, neither encouraging nor rejecting them outright, her attention already turning, with quiet determination, toward the Saturday evening in early summer that waited at the end of her long, private year of silence. The theater Nathan used for his recital series sat on a quiet side street, a converted cinema with worn red seats, and a stage lit by a handful of warm spotlights that gave the whole room a soft, golden glow. Alina arrived 2 hours early on the Saturday evening that marked the end of her silent year, carrying her sheet music in a folder she had covered, months earlier, in plain brown paper, deliberately unmarked, so that no curious glance at home might reveal what it contained. She had told Julian only that she had errands to run that evening, a vague excuse that had grown easier to offer the more practice she had gotten over the past year. He had not questioned her closely, distracted by preparations for a work trip departing early the following week. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Alina felt no guilt at all in the small deception, only a steady, quiet determination that carried her through the empty afternoon streets toward the theater. Backstage, Nathan greeted her with a warm hug and a program listing 8 performers for the evening, her name printed near the bottom in careful black type. Alina Marquez, not Grace, just Alina, the name she had given Nathan when she first agreed to perform, the name she intended to reclaim fully and publicly, in front of an audience that owed nothing to Julian and carried no memory of the year that had passed. She had invited only 2 people. Priya sat near the front of the theater, saving a seat beside her, glancing frequently toward the stage door with an expression of nervous excitement. Margaret sat beside her daughter's best friend, her hands folded tightly in her lap, having driven 2 hours that afternoon the moment Alina called to invite her, her voice trembling slightly as she asked, "Are you sure, sweetheart? Are you really ready?" "I'm ready, Mom," Alina had said, and for the first time in a year she had believed her own words completely. The evening began with a young cellist, followed by 2 singers and a violinist whose performance drew warm, enthusiastic applause from the modest but attentive audience. Alina sat in the wings, listening to each performance, feeling her heartbeat quicken steadily as her turn drew closer, her hands cool and slightly trembling in her lap. When Nathan finally stepped onto the stage and announced her name, clearly and simply, Alina Marquez, performing an original composition, Alina rose from her seat backstage and walked out into the warm spotlight, her breath steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. She sat down at the piano, adjusted the bench slightly, and rested her fingers on the keys for a long moment before beginning, the same posture she had practiced alone in the dark hundreds of times over the past year, except now. For the first time, the darkness was gone, replaced by light and by the quiet, attentive presence of an audience waiting to hear what she had built. She began to play. The piece opened quietly, uncertain notes circling one another the way they had on that very first night after the dinner party. A fragile, searching melody that seemed to ask a question it did not yet know how to answer. Slowly, the melody gathered strength, moving through passages that grew more confident, more insistent, before dissolving again into moments of hesitation, echoes of every night Alina had sat frozen in silence, unable to speak the words gathering inside her. Halfway through, the music shifted into something sharper, more urgent, chords building on top of one another with a kind of controlled intensity that filled the theater, drawing the audience forward in their seats. This was the silence breaking, note by note, the year of quiet rebellion finally given full voice through the only language that had remained entirely her own throughout the entire ordeal. In the final movement, the melody resolved itself slowly, deliberately, each note landing with a clarity and certainty that had been entirely absent from the piece's uncertain opening. The music did not end quietly. It ended with a firm, resonant chord, held just long enough to fill every corner of the room, before Alina lifted her hands from the keys and let the silence that followed carry its own weight. For a moment, the theater was completely still. Then the applause began, rising quickly into something warm and genuine, filling the space Alina had spent an entire year building in silence and secrecy. Priya was on her feet immediately, clapping enthusiastically, tears bright in her eyes. Margaret sat with both hands pressed to her mouth, her own eyes shining, pride and relief mixing openly across her face. Alina stood, gave a small, steady bow, and walked off the stage feeling lighter than she had felt in longer than she could remember. Backstage, Nathan congratulated her warmly, and several other performers stopped to offer compliments on the piece, asking questions about its inspiration that Alina answered honestly but carefully, not yet ready to share the full story behind the music. When the evening's program finally concluded, she made her way out into the small lobby, where Priya and Margaret were waiting, both of them pulling her into a tight, overlapping hug the moment she appeared. "That was beautiful, Alina," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion, deliberately, warmly using her daughter's full and only name. "I don't have the words for how proud I am." "You don't need words," Alina said, hugging her mother tightly. "I think I understand that better than most people right now." It was as they stood together in the lobby, still glowing from the performance, that Alina saw him. Julian stood near the theater's front doors, still in his work clothes, his expression a mixture of confusion and something harder underneath, something that had not yet decided whether to become anger. He must have come home earlier than planned, found the apartment empty, and eventually traced her whereabouts through a message Nathan had once sent to their shared address months earlier, back when Alina had still been careless about keeping her two lives separate. He crossed the lobby quickly, stopping just in front of her, his eyes flicking briefly toward Margaret and Priya before returning to Alina. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. Though Alina could hear the tightness beneath it. "You told me you had errands." "I did have somewhere to be," Alina said, and her voice, to her own surprise, came out entirely steady, entirely calm. "This was it." "You've been planning this, for how long?" "A year," Alina said simply. Julian's expression shifted, confusion deepening into something more wounded. "A year? You've been hiding this from me for an entire year." "Yes," Alina said, "I have." "Why would you do that?" His voice rose slightly, drawing a few curious glances from performers still lingering nearby. "I've given you everything, a home, a life. I gave you a name that suited who you really are." Alina felt Priya's hand tighten protectively on her arm, but she did not need the support the way she might have a year earlier. Something inside her had settled into a quiet, unshakable certainty over the course of the evening, over the course, really, of the entire silent year that had led to this moment. "You didn't give me a name, Julian," Alina said, her voice calm but unwavering, carrying clearly across the small lobby. "You took one. There's a difference even if you never understood it. My name is Alina. It was Alina before you met me, and it stayed Alina the entire time you were calling me something else. I just stopped correcting you. That's not the same thing as agreeing." Julian opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time since Alina had known him, no smooth, confident words arrived to fill the silence. He stood there, visibly searching for something to say and finding nothing, his certainty, for once, entirely absent. "I'm not angry at you the way I once might have been," Alina continued, her voice softening slightly, though it lost none of its steadiness. "I think you believed, in your own way, that you were giving me something good. But a name isn't something you give someone else to wear, Julian. It's something that already belongs to them. You spent a year trying to convince me otherwise, and I spent that same year quietly building myself back, note by note, until I had enough of myself left to stand here and tell you this to your face." "Grace," Julian began, reaching toward her. "Alina," she corrected, gently but firmly, stepping back just slightly out of his reach. "My name is Alina. It always was." The lobby had gone quiet around them, performers and small clusters of audience members politely pretending not to listen while clearly hearing every word. Julian glanced around, seeming to notice, for the first time, the small audience gathered around their conversation, and something in his posture deflated slightly under the weight of being witnessed so plainly. "Can we talk about this at home?" he asked, his voice quieter now, some of its earlier edge replaced by something closer to genuine uncertainty. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about," Alina said. "I'm going to stay here a little longer, celebrate with my mother and my friend. I'll come by the apartment tomorrow to collect my things." "Alina." "Thank you for using my name," Alina said, and for the first time since he had approached her, something like a small, genuine smile crossed her face, though there was no cruelty in it, only a quiet, hard-won relief. "That's a good place to start." Julian stood in the lobby for a long moment after she turned away, watching her walk back toward her mother and Priya, rejoining the small circle of women who had supported the private, patient work of the past year without ever once asking her to be anyone other than exactly who she already was. Eventually, without another word, he turned and left the theater, the door swinging shut quietly behind him. Alina did not watch him go. She was already deep in conversation with Nathan, who had approached to ask if she might consider performing again at the next recital, already planning, in the small, practical way that had carried her through the entire silent year, what piece she might write next, what story it might tell, now that she finally had a voice free enough to tell it. The following afternoon, Alina returned to the apartment she had shared with Julian for the better part of 2 years, moving through the rooms methodically, gathering her belongings into boxes with the same steady calm that had carried her through the recital the night before. Julian was not home, having left, according to a brief note on the kitchen counter, to give her the space she needed, a small gesture that felt to Alina both genuinely kind and entirely too late. She paused only once during the packing, standing in front of the piano in the corner of the living room, still angled slightly toward the wall exactly as it had been the day she first moved in. She ran her fingers gently along its polished surface, remembering every quiet, hidden hour she had spent there over the past year, building something entirely her own in a space that had never quite felt like home. Alina did not take the piano with her that day. She arranged, instead, for a moving company to collect it the following week, transporting it carefully to the small apartment she had already begun renting with the money quietly saved over the course of her silent year, an apartment with wide, sunlit windows and enough space, finally, for a piano to sit fully turned toward the room, facing outward rather than away. Months later, standing in that same sunlit apartment, preparing for another recital, this one entirely her own idea from the very beginning, Alina would sometimes think back to the night at the wedding, so long ago now, when a charming, confident man had looked at her across a crowded room and decided on his own who she was going to become. She thought of it not with anger, though the anger had certainly been there in its time, worked through slowly in the pages of a notebook, and the quiet hours of practice that had carried her through an entire year of silence. She thought of it, instead, with a kind of steady, grateful clarity, the understanding that had finally emerged from everything that happened. A name is not a gift someone else can give you. It is something you already carry quietly, even through the years when your own voice grows too quiet to defend it. And sometimes, reclaiming it does not require shouting. Sometimes it only requires patience and music, and a year of careful, deliberate silence, followed by one clear, unwavering sentence spoken calmly in a room full of witnesses to the only person who ever needed to hear it. My name is Elena, it always was. She never called herself Grace again.